Kyle here with another episode of the Art of Physical Fitness show. Today I have an interview with Mike T. Nelson of MikeTNelson.com. Mike, say hi to the folks out there and tell us the 411 on you and why they should care about what you have to say.
Hey guys, I'm Mike T. Nelson, as you know. Thank you very much for having me do the interview here. Greatly appreciate it. I've always enjoyed the past ones you've had, so it's very cool. Sort of the intermediate story on me is that I'm one of those college geeks that has been in school like for freaking ever. I started in 1992, did a Bachelor of Arts in Natural Science, and then decided that I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, so decided to go into engineering. So did 2 years of engineering stuff at Michigan Tech, and then decided, well, I'll be really nutty and stay for a master's. So I ended up doing a master's actually in mechanical engineering then, sort of more on the biomechanics type side. Got done with that, swore I was never going back to school. It was like 7.5 years full time. I said, oh, that's it. That lasted about 1.5 years and started taking more physiology classes again. And then I did a short stint in the biomed department, the PhD department at the University of Minnesota. Decided I really didn't want to do that the rest of my life. I had this horrible class on MRIs. And I think MRIs are like super cool, but I knew I was screwed when the guy's like, and now we're going to derive all the mathematical equations that MRIs use to calculate stuff. I'm like, oh, you got to be kidding me. I don't want to be here. So I actually fled over to the kinesiology department. And unfortunately, then I had to start over from ground zero again. And that was about 6 years ago. So I'm doing a PhD in exercise physiology. My main topic's metabolic flexibility, which we'll probably get into a little bit. And if all goes well, kind of has to go well at this point, I'll be done this May. So hopefully just a few more months left, which will be very, very nice. Training-wise, started training just as a normal guy. In college, I was about, my first year in college, like 6'3", weighed about 156. So I'm like, well, I got to go to the gym to figure stuff out. So I, sign up at college and I'm like, oh, they have a class that teaches you about weightlifting. I'm like, perfect. So I sign up to it and the guy kind of looks around at everyone in the class and he's like, well, some of you may need to lose some weight. And he looks right at me and he goes, whoa, and some of you need to gain a lot of weight. Did everything wrong for many years and just for lots of trial and error kind of, figured stuff out, which caused me to do more research and then try that out and see how that works. And then eventually doing that with, clients and seeing how they respond and that type of thing too. So it's been a very interesting journey, but it's been good.
Awesome. Well, awesome introduction. So I'm going to first go into the question that was asked to us on Facebook. I asked you more in specific on Facebook to start us off about, the person was asking about Z-Health. First, let's just, what the heck is Z-Health, and then we'll get into the question itself.
Oh, sure. So Z-Health is a system that I actually did a bunch of their training in the past. The co-founder is Dr. Eric Cobb. And the premise of it is that it's a lot of, I guess, neurologically based. And the theory is that your body's all, connected as one. And then the nervous system is what, runs sort of the show from that perspective. And the primary mechanism that they use is isolated joint mobility. So what they call an arthrokinetic reflex. So if I have like a bummed up, let's say, right elbow or something that's not right, neurologically, my brain is smart enough to say, okay, I'm not going to let you curl a heavy weight with your right arm because I know you've got a bad, right elbow. So it's going to try to shut down a little bit of the muscular function there in order to try to protect the elbow. Because if you look at physiology, pretty much all physiology is very much survival based. Our whole goal in life from a physiologic standpoint is just to survive. And if, that may have short acute cost to it, but if we can still survive, it's going to be a benefit. So if I lift less weight at the gym tomorrow, but I can keep my elbow intact for a longer period of time, that's then a positive for survival because I can feed myself and throw rocks at rabbits or whatever else I need to do. So it's very much a neurologic based system. The primary system they use is joint mobility. There is some more advanced work that they do with vision, eye movements, and then also vestibular, which is kind of what controls the thing in your head for balance and that type of thing.
Okay, great. So let's get right into the question then. The two questions, I think, is basically a two-part thing. First, during the assessment process, how do you discover which joints need mobilization when working with a client?
Yeah, so there's two ways. The typical way they do is primarily a gait analysis. So you'll watch someone walk back and forth, and you're watching their movement. So you're evaluating the body as an entire whole system. And the nice part about walking or gait is that it's what they call an autonomous motion. We don't really have to think too much about it. So if I told you to walk into your kitchen and get me a glass of water, you wouldn't have to think, okay, right foot, left foot, okay, place my arm here, that type of thing. You just walk from one distance to the next. So if you can get someone to walk normally, you can kind of see what their underlying movement patterns are. If you ever get bored at the airport or the mall, just kind of sit there and just kind of watch people walk by, and you'll see all sorts of really goofy stuff. So the theory then is you would do like a joint mobility for, let's say, my elbow, and then you would watch me walk to see, is my gait better or not. You can take that a step further and actually do a self-assessment. So I can do like a flex forward bend, just a range of motion. Then basically just bending forward until I feel tension and then stopping there. And that would give me an assessment of where my current range of motion is. Then I could do maybe an elbow mobility drill, and then I could, reassess my own movement. Initially, when I was in Z Health, the gait was a primary assessment. I'm not sure if they've added much for a self range of motion or not, but it's something I use that I got from a guy I know, Frankie Ferries, for the movement. So we kind of use that self-assessment a fair amount. But at simplest level is that if you watch someone move, the question you'd want to ask is what is not moving that should be moving, and then try to move that under their own control and then see if that makes it better. Usually when you watch people move, the thing that moves too much is the thing that's automatically going to catch your eye. So you can imagine so for example, I busted up my right ankle in a snowboarding incident about 7 years ago. So I'm walking with basically a frozen right ankle. And to do that, you can just try it out yourself when you walk. You'll notice that something on the other side of your body starts moving more in order to compensate for that lack of movement. And what you'll see is the thing that's moving too much, because that'll catch your eye right away. And what you want to kind of look for is the thing that's not moving that should be. Most of the time, if you can get that to start moving again, most of the time then you'll see a much greater improvement in their performance and strength and that type of thing.
Fantastic. So how has, continuing on with this question, how you finish it up, how has this impacted your outlook when you work with your clients?
The good thing that I did really learn about it is to look at just sort of their overall movement. And I know there's a lot of, so I did a lot of the one-off assessments for a while. I don't do too many of them anymore just due to time constraints and stuff. And what you found is, so for example, a while back, a guy came in with a bad shoulder. He had gone to 2 physicians and I think 2 other physical therapists. And he had the shoulder injury for quite a long time. I don't remember exactly how it happened. And so I asked him, I said, so all these people you've been to, I said, how many of them have looked at your shoulder? And he's like, well, all 4 of them did. And I'm like, did they look at anything else in your body? He's like, well, no. I'm like, did it make any difference in your shoulder? It's like, no. So I'm like, well, probably not the shoulder. It could be, but, let's look and see if there's something else wrong somewhere else. So in this case, for him, it was his opposite hip. So his opposite hip was pretty frozen, didn't want to move well, basically got that to move a little bit better, and then his right shoulder was a lot better. So if you look at it from a mechanical standpoint, there's something called the serrape effect, where the right lat works with basically the left hip and the glute. So you've got your lat that kind of comes down through the body, transfers through a lot of fascia, through a very thick tendon, and then transfers that motion to the other side, right? So when you're walking, you've got, your left side is doing something, your right side is doing the opposite to try to keep your body balanced. So in this case, it was his left hip that appeared to be transmitting something that was not so good and sort of bumming up his right shoulder. Got the left hip to move a little bit better, and his pain and movement got much better in the right shoulder.
Okay. One question I had on Z Health on like feeling better type of thing, for someone who squats heavy a lot or just squats frequently, hip pain could be an issue, especially if
Yeah.
you're doing a lot of bilateral. I've dealt with it myself in the past, and I do a lot of squatting very frequently. So, what are some of the things that you suggest to get over that, and then alterations to prevent it from recurring?
Yeah, it's usually what I see for hip pain. The first place I'll look is the feet and the ankles. Then there's a lot of people wearing more minimalist shoes now, which I think is a really good idea. So if we go back to like the example with the right elbow and let's say the bicep. So that's pretty easy to see because the bicep comes across, it attaches, on the other side of the elbow. It's a prime mover, prime joint. But the same thing will happen with the feet and the hips. So if you think about someone who's sprinting, we know that sprinting, they're exerting, depending on what literature you believe, 6 to 10 times the force of their body. So a lot of that force is going through the foot and the ankle. And the primary driver of that motion is the hip, if we were to pick out just one area. So neurologically, your brain's going, okay, if I've got a bum right ankle, let's say, and it's not working the way that it should, I don't really want to put that much force through it because I'm very survival based. I want to try to protect that. So the way to protect it is to not allow the hip to create as much force. So if I reduce the strength that's being going to the hip, I can then protect the foot and the ankle, and therefore I can make it for the next couple of days, couple of years. Downside is that that's obviously going to affect your performance, and over time, if you keep adding load to that, you can end up with sort of some repetitive issues. So for a lot of people, I look at the foot and the ankle, make sure it's mobile and that type of thing. Most people switching to a more mobile shoe makes a massive difference. So you can do all the foot and ankle mobility you want, but if you stick it back in a stiff shoe all day, every time you walk, your foot and your ankle now are becoming very, very stiff again. So you're kind of counteracting all the good work that you did with the mobility and that type of thing. So almost all the people I work with having to go to a more mobile shoe, whether it's a Vibram or Adidas has some now, Nike Free, there's all sorts of different ones. That makes a big difference in trying to keep the foot and the ankle nice and mobile during the day. As they're working through it, I don't really want anyone to exercise in pain. If it's painful, I don't really want them to do it. I do have a lot of luck with looking at people and having them do a more asymmetric exercise. So let's say your right hip is bugging you. I would look at shifting the load potentially to the left side or to the right side. But if you're trying to get better at squatting, I would want to try to make that as squat specific as possible. So one of the easiest variations to do is what's called a B stance. So B as in boy. So if you have both feet kind of even here, imagine now I'm going to slide my right foot back, and I may even come up on the ball of my foot a little bit. But I'm going to try to do the same squatting type motion. So what will happen is if you look at it from a side view, the squat will look the same. But because of the shift in the position of the feet, I'm now overloading this left side significantly more because there's going to be more weight on it. So what that does is it tends to even out a little bit of imbalances people may have. And that weight shift may help them bring up a weak side and also may shift them away from an area that's painful.
So, with that being said, do you think you're getting a little too far away or the load's not high enough if you do, say, a Bulgarian split squat in that same regard, or what?
Yeah, you can do a Bulgarian split squat. What's interesting about that, though, what I've seen, is people who get better at that exercise usually get better at weighting the foot that's actually up on the bench. So they're trying to actually, ironically, balance themselves out because they know if they do, they can create a little more force. Granted, there's still a lot of force that's on, the leg that's down. If I do have people do that, like unilateral type stuff, I rarely will have them, I don't like to use the word prescribe, but I'll really have them do the same amount for both sides. So if you look at almost every program that's out there, they'll say, okay, dude, your problem is you've got an imbalance. We need to work on unilateral stuff. So I want you to do 3 sets of 10 Bulgarian split squats on your left side and your right side. I'm like, okay, but if my left side is really weak and my right side is okay, why don't I just do the left side then? So I usually find if I do unilateral work, I usually only have people do it on one side. Most of the time it's going to be their weaker side. And And then beyond that, one I've played around with lately is sort of like a Bulgarian split squat, but dividing it between a top motion and a bottom motion. And I got this from my buddy Cal Dietz. So you're doing like an oscillating motion. So at the top, you may only go down maybe a few inches, but you're oscillating back and forth in that position. Or you may go down towards the bottom and oscillate up and down at the bottom in that position. It's a little bit more of an advanced thing. You have to make sure you can hold the positions within each one of those range. But in essence, you're working that range of motion that you may be weakest in. So some people may be usually weaker at the bottom. So you're basically providing more overload, more speed to just that bottom range of motion then.
Okay. A question just came in on Facebook on that thread. Quick. The question is from Kendrick, and he asked, "Foot positioning while squatting, toes pointed outwards or forwards?" Want to know your thoughts on it. So I figured it's apropos to pull.
Oh, that's awesome. Now. The reality is it's going to vary for most people. There's very, very few people in my experience that can go very deep with their feet perfectly straight. It's just, you can try it and it looks kind of like a skier squat, but to do that, you have to have a lot of dorsiflexion. So basically allowing the knee to come really far over the foot. If you look at even a lot of people do very deep Olympic squats, Olympic lifting, they're usually rotated out somewhat angled, and they have a really high amount of dorsiflexion. So they can get their knee quite a bit of ways out over their toe. Their knee won't magically explode if that happens. You know, most people, their body will allow you to handle that range of motion. So usually most people are going to be externally rotated a little bit. Also depends on how deep you go. Depends on how long and how wide your femurs are and your levers and that type of thing. Usually people with longer levers in general will probably have to have a little bit more external rotation and that type of thing. So for most people, what I see is that it's usually the dorsiflexion that's limiting them. So if you watch their ankle, their knee, and their hip from the side, you'll see that their knee comes out, and all of a sudden it just it stops, and then their hip is still coming down. And ideally, you would want the ankle, knee, and hip to all move at the same time, right? So you imagine like those, if you've ever had to change your car with those old school jacks, where it's got just the 3 pins on it, and you've got the circular screw mechanism in the middle. Yeah. All 3 of those angles are actually moving at the same rate. And that's going to allow you the most, from a physics standpoint, force development. Anatomically, not everyone can get away doing that, but that would be more of a, from a physics standpoint, more the motion you would be striving to get.
Awesome. All right, the questions just keep on coming in, and actually they're coming in at the right time because they're going right with the transitions that I wanted to go with. So I wanted to go now a little bit onto the nutrition side of discussion. And one quote that you made, I read an article of yours, was that the goal is adaptability, not being restrictive for no good reason. I believe this article you were talking about paleo, but yeah. But let's go into a little further, and we'll come back to Daniel who posed this question. But they're all based on nutrition. We'll come back to it after this question.
No worries. So I just don't find that in practice, a very restrictive approach for most people works that well. So when I first started working with people, probably like 2006, I had taken a fair amount of physiology by that point, and I kind of idiotically assumed that, okay, I know a fair amount about physiology. Working with clients, this is going to be pretty easy. And after the first couple, I realized right away that it's probably more the psychology than it was the physiology, because I had a guy who came in and said, okay, here's exactly what you need to do. Kind of nods his head a little bit, leaves, comes back 2 weeks later. I'm like, hey, what's, going on? He's like, well, I just didn't do anything you told me to. I'm like, really? And I'm like thinking, well, that's odd. So I tell him to do it again. Leaves, comes back 2 weeks later, same thing. And so this happened with multiple people. And at some point you have to kind of go, okay, even if this is right from a physiology standpoint, it doesn't matter because they're not doing any of it anyway. And so I did some more research and stuff. And so now what I do is I don't ever really tell people not to do something per se. So let's say somebody comes in and, they're rather overweight, probably judging that they have an intolerance to carbohydrates, which is pretty common. They're not active, they're overweight and have a history of diabetes. So in the past, I would say, all right, we need to lower your carbohydrates because I know that's going to help you. And that would be, correct on our best assumption on the literature. But in reality, that doesn't seem like that works very well. So now what I tell them is, okay, I actually want you to eat more protein. And they kind of look at me funny, and I'm like, well, how much more? I'm like, yeah, just more than where you're at now. Eventually top in maybe a gram per pound of body weight, just kind of a rough approximation. And they're like, okay, but I can eat more than that? I'm like, don't care. If you weigh 150 pounds and you want to eat 200 grams a day, go for it. I could care less. And they're like, oh, okay. Because I know, and there's some literature from Dr. Lehman's lab to show that if they eat more protein, they will almost automatically, unconsciously decrease their carbohydrate intake. So am I trying to get them to eat less carbohydrates? I am. If I tell them to do that because it's more of a negative restrictive, it just doesn't seem to work that well. And then there's the mindset of, well, I'm on a diet, it has to be restrictive. And then their only solution then is, well, it's not working, I have to be more restrictive. That must be the answer. So now I got to get up to 2 hours of cardio a day and, instead of 1,200 calories, 900 calories. And at some point, it just doesn't work. No one can, stay on that stuff sort of long term. And most of the time, that type of restriction, I don't think is even needed. Another one to do is have them write down for 3 days, 2 days during the week and a weekend day, everything that they eat, and then look at it and go, okay, the next experiment is for the next week, I don't want you to repeat the same meal more than once. And they kind of stare at you funny, and they're like, so I could have like chocolate cake for breakfast tomorrow? I'm like, yeah, cool, have chocolate cake tomorrow, but you can't have it the rest of the week then. They're like, oh, okay. But I could have a bagel? I'm like, yeah, have a bagel. I don't really care. They're like, really? But you can't repeat anything. So I'm basically trying to get them to eat, more variety. And of course, I want them to look at fruits and vegetables and different types of meat and that type of thing too. But just by doing that, they automatically seem to eat less and eat better. And if you've ever tried it, trying not to repeat anything during the week is actually really, really hard. And I don't even get close to that variety myself. So increasing variety, increasing protein. So the things that I have them do are usually emphasized on do more. And that gets them out of this extremely restrictive mindset of that the only solution has got to be more work harder, and then less calories. And that just doesn't, in my opinion, work long term.
So saying that you don't believe in the long term, do you kind of agree? I know Dan John talks about this, but agree with the premise of if you're going to do something restrictive, set a time limit, a short time limit on it, like 1 month, like the velocity diet that Dan John talks about,
Yep.
Nation. But 1 month, then after that, go back to, I want to say easy, but something that's sustainable. Just go into a very sustainable diet that you can live a life on. You agree with
Yep.
that?
Yeah, I definitely, if I have anyone do anything restrictive, it's almost always for a time limit. So maybe they have a show coming up, they need to step on stage at, single digit body fat or whatever, but they have a set time limit. And then ideally, if I have enough time, I want them to know what a sustainable lifestyle is first. Because some people come in and the only thing that they know is something very restrictive. So even if you put a time limit on their restriction, they don't know what to do when they come off. So their next thing is, well, I got a show now in like 8 months. It's like, okay. So then they automatically think they have to be restrictive again. But yes, if they do that, I would much rather have them do it for a set period of time. And even then, while they're being restrictive, still trying to get as much variety and as much sort of expansion within that. So if their carbohydrates are being more restricted, can they eat a wider variety of vegetables? Can they eat a wider variety of meats? Can they get, lamb or cow or pig or turkey or, kill deer in their backyard or whatever? There's usually something within that area that they can still try to be a little bit more expansive.
Okay. Let's finish up before we go into metabolic flexibility, which we'll spend a lot of time on, I believe. We'll get to Daniel's question here. And he wants to know, it's kind of a multi-part question, but your take on intermittent fasting, cheat days, metabolic typing, and carb cycling.
All right. Well, you'll have to probably remind me of I got intermittent fasting. We'll start there. Remind me of the other three.
Okay.
I actually do really like intermittent fasting. When it first came out, I first heard about it from my buddy Brad Pilon, does Eat Stop Eat, good guy. I heard about it and I was like, at the time, I was very much must eat every 2 to 3 hours, because I was a skinny bastard and that worked for me to, gain weight and all that kind of stuff. So my mindset was then that's the only thing that works. And, you have some clients that do that and they get success and you get success. So you get really stuck. That's the only way. So I was actually down at a Z Health event and was out at Subway with my buddy Jason Reimer. And he's telling me, he's like, yeah, I started this intermittent fasting thing and it's working really well. I'm looking at him and I'm going, that doesn't, you just don't eat? He's like, yeah, dude. I'm like, whoa, that just sounds so wrong. Because everything I knew was the direct opposite of that. So now I'm like, oh, okay, that, I kind of did the same thing Brad Pilon did. It's like, I'm going to go find the literature and I'm going to show that this is just bullshit. This doesn't work. And what you find is there's not a ton of literature. And what you end up seeing is that sort of this fear of muscle loss has been grossly over-exaggerated. Even most people who don't like intermittent fasting will agree that within a 24-hour period, the amount of muscle that's going to be lost is pretty much non-existent. So there wasn't really muscle loss, and I'm like, oh, okay. So eventually I tried it, and the first couple of times went horrible because I had stuck in my head that, okay, I'm doing a fast, I have to go, full 24 hours. And I got to about hour 10 and I wanted to gnaw my arm off. I'm like, this is horrible. I'm never doing this again. This is crap. So then I'm like, okay, well, what if I do it more of a progressive nature? Instead of trying to go 24 hours the first day, what if I only go, 10 and then 12 and then 14? And eventually I got to the point where I could go 24 hours pretty easily. So I'm like, okay. And when I started looking at metabolic flexibility stuff, which we'll get into in a minute, you find that intermittent fasting actually fits really well with that. And from a lifestyle perspective, I also found that it's much more freeing to not have to worry about eating every 2 to 3 hours. I went on a trip at that time to before this to France, and I was like the world's biggest pain in the butt to travel. I had like half my suitcase full of protein bars, and I was like cranky if I didn't eat every 3 hours, and it was just kind of a nightmare. Where now it's like, I've gone for 32 hours at some points without eating, and it's not, once you get used to it and your body can then basically use body fat, it's really not too bad. It's not a requirement. I mean, there's some people who have a harder time with it, and if they only do it once a week for 14 hours, that's fine. I don't try to force them into a magical time period. But I find that I do like it, and I usually set it up now so that my fasting days are usually my busiest days, since I don't have to stop to eat at that point. So
okay.
There's 3 other parts to that question, I think, right? What are the other 2 or the next one?
Cheat days.
Yeah. I understand the physiologic significance of it, but a cheat day implies that the rest of your time was really uber restrictive. And what you'll see in some people is that, and not that it can't work, is that I don't like the psychological mindset of, okay, I got to be like super restrictive 6 days a week, and then Sunday, man, all bets are off. I'm going bonkers. And what you find is, especially with guys, it turns into a competition. Well, I ate 6 Krispy Kremes. Oh, screw you, I can eat 7. And it just, I don't like the sort of the psychology of it. What I'd rather have people do is just not be so restrictive, during the week. And eventually, long term, you can self-regulate yourself. And so while I'm not, uber lean now, that's not my goal. My goal now is just to graduate. But at the same point, I can still regulate myself within, where I want to be. And, last night I had cheesecake and ice cream for dessert. And today I didn't eat till 10 in the morning. I got up at 6:15. So it's, your body gives you feedback and hunger signals and all those things for a very good reason. And if you look at people that are ironically very weight stable, you'll see that their caloric intake from one day to the next actually fluctuates quite a amount. And you've noticed that, right? So if you go out and you have a day where you eat a lot of calories, most people, if they're reasonably healthy, are not that hungry the next day. But if the program says, well, here's what you have to eat the next day, I think that having cheat days psychologically sets you up to be restrictive And okay, now you're not restrictive. Now you got to go as far as you can to the other end of the spectrum.
That is a great response. I love that. Number 3, metabolic typing.
I don't know that much about it, to be honest. I think most of it was from Walcott's stuff. I know some people that have good results with it. I just don't personally believe that it's that simple. The ones I've seen that tend to work okay for people are actually very detailed. So very, very detailed questions. There's not a lot of blood work you can tell. There's the old blood type diet. Hey, look at your blood type and here's what you're supposed to eat. It's like, it's just, nothing's ever that simple, I don't think. The easiest way is just keep a nutrition log and then write down how you feel after it. You know, so if you think you have like a gluten intolerance, because everyone's convinced now that gluten's, you know, the sperm of Satan or whatever, you know, and some people have issues with it, and I have clients who have issues with it, and other people don't have any issues with it at all. But the easiest way to figure it out is to write down what you eat, right? So now you're becoming aware of what you're actually eating, because most people have no idea. They will tell you that they have an idea, but they usually don't. So when people came in initially, I used to argue with them about nutrition like all the time. And because I'm like, I know that if you're 40 pounds overweight and you've been exercising, there's something nutritionally you probably need to change if you want to lose weight. So at some point I just said, okay, screw this. And I'm like, I'm just going to have them write down. So I had one guy who was so funny, comes in, we're arguing about nutrition for like an hour. And I'm like, all right, dude, don't worry about it. Here, take this, write down everything you eat and drink for the next 3 days, and then just bring it in next time. We'll keep it as your baseline. You know, we'll have it on file. If anything changes, we'll repeat it in the future. It's like, oh, okay. Comes back in 2 weeks later. He kind of has his head down. And I'm like, are you all right? He's like, yeah, here's my nutrition. And yeah, my nutrition just sucks, man. And he was so convinced before that it was just awesome. And it wasn't that he was wrong. He just had no awareness to it at all. And that's commonly what I see. So now I don't even argue with him about nutrition. Just here, go write it down, come back. Okay, well, how was that? Oh, it's not so good. And then the next step is write it down. Well, how did you feel afterwards? So you had, 15 pancakes for breakfast, and then, oh, look, you felt great for a half hour, and then you passed out on the couch for 3 hours. Okay, that's good to know. So then looking at that and saying, okay, if you feel worse, let's try to eat less of that. If you feel better, let's try to eat more of that. And so in general, I think that's a much better approach. It's easier, it's specific to the person. It builds automatic awareness into it so that they will subconsciously pay attention to that at the end. And I don't necessarily tell them not to eat something, so I'll just say, you have to decide at the end, right? So if you eat a bagel and you feel horrible, but you still want the bagel and know you're going to feel horrible, okay, that's for you to decide. That's not for me to tell you that don't eat the bagel. But I want you to know what the cost is, if you do that. If you're okay with that and you realize it, then that's fine. That's where I would have people start with that.
That is pure gold. I love that. Test, assess, and adjust. That's the whole process.
Oh, yeah. And then, the whole goal is that eventually it sounds so odd, but eventually I don't want to work with that person again. It's not that I don't like them or not that I don't want to help them. It's that I want them to reach a level where they can do it on their own. Right. Because that means then I can help someone else come in. They can go off and do it on their own. And, hopefully in the future, those people can help other people. Instead of, it sounds horrible to say, but I know some trainers who their whole goal is to get the clients to be as dependent as possible upon them because they know they make a lot more money from it.
Right.
And I don't agree with that because once you leave, then it's like, well, they don't know anything. They can't operate on their own. So I actually just do the complete opposite of that. So.
Right, absolutely. Agree with you there. The fourth one that Daniel wanted to talk about, and he basically kind of addressed it on it, but carb cycling. And
yeah. I think it's good, depending on how it's done. I mean, if you look at people who are really trying to get a lot leaner, while there's not tons of literature to support carb cycling, it anecdotally does seem to work. I mean, if you go all the way back to, Vince Gironda and even guys before him, I mean, carb cycling's been around in some form for a long period of time. with metabolic flexibility, I use in essence a form of carb cycling, where you'll have periods of fasting or low carb or moderate to high carb days. Yeah, so I think it can work. Eventually, I like people to have it be a little bit more automatic. In essence, hey, I ate more carbohydrates today. Maybe I'll just eat a few less tomorrow. I think that's a little bit better than. There's a point for a template, and I think that can be definitely useful to get people moving in the right direction, as long as they realize that that template may not work forever, and that it's okay to adjust within that, and then basically go eventually, beyond that. So yeah, I think carb cycling can work. The caveat I would have with people though is that if they're going to go into the low carbohydrate portion, do that much more gradually, because what you'll see, and this shows up in the research too. So years ago, I was thinking, I'm like, okay, so people who are aerobic, right, who do a lot of running, what is the main fuel for running? If you're running at a moderate intensity, right, everyone's heard of the fat burning zone, and that's actually true. You do use more fat at a moderate exercise intensity. So I'm like, okay, so if we take someone, we put them on a low carbohydrate diet, we increase their body's ability to use fat, then we should see for aerobic performance an increase in performance. And if you look at a lot of the original stuff on fat adaptation and fat loading, research on it's pretty split. It wasn't as clear as what I wanted. But so then I had some clients come in, we did some stuff, and pretty much every time that we did a very hard transition, so they went from their normal high carbohydrate diet to, let's say they started an Atkins introduction phase on Monday. So no carbohydrates, very, very low, almost ketogenic type diet. And they go, oh my God, I feel horrible. They want to like kill you the first couple of weeks. And then they kind of start to feel a little bit better. And what it seemed to be is that eventually they never got to the point where those very low carbohydrate days were very good for them. But another group of people I took and just had them sort of slowly decrease, they seem to get there much faster, and they seem to be okay at a lower carbohydrate set point. Same thing with fasting. Most of the people who can't go for a full 24 hours are usually the people that have never done much fasting and were convinced that Monday's fasting day, and they're going to force 24 hours. And there's tend to be the ones that don't like it as much. So I think of it as, if you can do gradual transitions with your body, it's probably going to be much better than very fast transitions. So fast transitions is much more, I would say, of an advanced state, and something you actually have to train for, right? So even look at lifting, right? So speed of a lift, people who are advanced can move weight much, much faster from a dead stop to a faster speed. Athletes who are better can accelerate from a dead stop to a faster speed. People who are more conditioned can go from a high heart rate to recovery to a low heart rate much faster. So I think fast transitions are more of an advanced state, and then consequently take more training to get to that. So getting back to what I said about fat adaptation, and I think if you could do a study where the introduction was much slower, I think you would see better results. The hard part is that's a horrible pain in the ass from a study to do, because now you're prolonging the study, now you've got a lot longer time, and it makes it a lot messier too. So.
Okay. Well, let's get right into metabolic flexibility. Go right ahead. 1, 2, 3, go.
So metabolic flexibility, in essence, is the ability to use the right fuel at the right time. And your body, so if you came into the lab at the U of M here, and we hooked you up to a metabolic cart, so we stuffed a little tube in your mouth, tube goes out to the gases into a machine, and it gives us a little number called the RER number. And that little number tells us with each breath that you breathe out, what percentage of fat and what percentage of carbohydrates you're actually using. And if you do enough of these tests, and God knows I've seen hundreds of them, you get, sounds horrible to say, but you get kind of bored, right? And so you're standing there, and you're just kind of watching this number. And I noticed on some people it kind of will oscillate around. So the person's under steady state exercise, they're not working harder, they're getting a little more fatigued. These are overnight fasted studies, they weren't drinking anything. And you would see that this number would kind of like just shift around. I'm like, well, that's kind of weird. And the number would be different between people. So we had one person came in, was a little more overweight, didn't really exercise much. Her number was actually quite a bit higher. So the higher the number means you're using more carbohydrates. And I'm like, huh, well, she was fasted overnight, and we actually had her come in again and repeated the test, same thing again. So I started thinking, huh, so it seems like her body is preferring, under the same conditions, to use more carbohydrates than someone else who is using more fat. And if you look in the literature, that's actually what you see. And you'll actually even see this in athletes. So Tim Noakes did a cool study several years ago showing that athletes would use a different mixture of fat versus carbohydrates, and their performance may still be pretty good, but each one may use a different sort of mix of fat versus carbohydrates. And if we look at like high intensity exercise, and a lot of people now are saying high intensity exercise is better for burning fat, and that's probably true. I would agree with that in the literature. So if you go out and run a 100-meter sprint, you're exercising really hard, really fast. So you're primarily using, creatine phosphate and carbohydrates. But as soon as you stop, the repayment of all that sort of energy is actually aerobic metabolism, or using fat as an energy source. So we see that switching of your body uses carbs, and then as soon as you stop, it uses fat. And what we find in like type 2 diabetics is this metabolic flexibility, the ability to switch back and forth becomes impaired. So if they come into the lab and we infuse them with insulin, we see that their body doesn't change that much. So their body is sort of stuck in between this fine range where it can't shift all the way down to use fat, and it can't shift all the way up to using carbohydrates. So they're kind of getting scrunched from both ends of the spectrum. So they're actually losing adaptability. And that's normally a hallmark feature of what you'll see is reduction of things as a disease progresses. So if you look at heart rate variability, you'll see that the variability of your heart rate gets less as you get a more of a disease process. Diabetics, for example, can only use a very narrow range of fat to carbohydrates. The metabolic flexibility is looking at how well can you change from fat to, say, carbohydrate metabolism, and then actually move back and forth between those two. The nice part is why someone should care is that when you go to the gym, you can then use carbohydrates, you can get a higher performance, because we know that to get the maximum amount of energy out, you have to use carbohydrates. You just can't get the maximum amount of energy out by using fat. It just bioenergetically can't happen. But when you leave the gym, you want to shift back then to using fat as a primary fuel again, because you want to get leaner. So this way you are able to keep your performance high and then still keep your body composition within range then too.
So how can you improve it then?
A good question. It's a little debatable, but the main ways are, so I look at it from, okay, how can I improve their carbohydrate use and how can I improve their utilization of fat? Most people, with the exception of type 2 diabetics, are relatively good at using carbohydrates. Most people actually have more of an issue of using fat as a fuel source. So one of the main things that actually controls the body's ability to use fat is insulin. So I like insulin as sort of a metabolic lever because it has a lot of effects. So if you open any physiology textbook and you look at what insulin does, and then you look at all the other hormones that do the opposite of what insulin does, epinephrine, norepinephrine, growth hormone, cortisol, those are actually all opposing the effects of insulin. So that would tell you that insulin must be pretty friggin' important then, right? If you have all these other hormones that are opposing just this one hormone on the other side. And the nice part about insulin is that we have some dietary control under it, by primarily modulating carbohydrates. So as insulin levels go up, it pushes the body to use more carbs. As insulin goes down, it pushes the body more towards fat usage. So when we talked about intermittent fasting, that's one of the reasons I like intermittent fasting, is that when you fast, by definition, you're not taking in anything that has calories. So since you're not taking anything that has calories, your insulin level will actually become lower and lower and lower. So at about 18 hours, your insulin level will actually plateau out. So the difference between 18 hours and 24 hours in terms of levels of insulin isn't really any different. And the nice part about that is it pushes the body to use more fats. And the nice part is that it actually will ramp up all the enzymes that are used in fatty acid metabolism and all those factors. And those sort of adaptations will actually stay for a period of time. So it's not like you have to go out and fast every single day. Anecdotally, about once a week for 18 to 24 hours seems to be enough. There is some literature to show that they had people who were not very metabolically flexible, and they put them on a fasting condition. And their body then was still able to move down and to switch to using fats as an energy source. Now, if we go back to what we said about a survival mechanism, that makes perfect sense, right? Because you only have a certain stored amount of glycogen, which is not a lot, but you've got tons of calories stored as fat. So if you could not switch to using fat when no calories are coming in, you're going to die pretty fast. And we don't typically see that, right? You don't see someone who's overweight who just died because their body couldn't use fat, right? The body's pretty smart. So fasting is a way to increase the ability to use fatty acids as a fuel source. And of course, you're not consuming any calories at that point either, so you've got obviously a caloric deficit at the same point then too.
Awesome. Well, we've had a lot to digest today. I just want to finish up talking about the fitness summit coming up in May. I know I'll be there. You'll be there. You're presenting, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Yep, I am. Correct.
What will you be presenting on?
Most likely, I'll probably be presenting on metabolic flexibility. I'm trying to make it a little bit more practical for people. So what is sort of the basic theory? And then also, what I'd like to do is just to try to change a little bit how physiology is taught. Oh, that sounds really boring. But have them think in sort of dynamic situations. So your body is almost always using some fat, always using some carbohydrates. We're just changing the mixture from one side to the next. And a lot of how physiology is taught says, well, you're all just using carbohydrates now, or oh, you're only using fat. It's taught as this sort of very one or the other. And it's actually just a rates of flow that determine it. So if you go out and do a hard sprint, your creatine phosphate system turns on, the lactate system turns on, or glycolysis, and actually the aerobic system turns on to try to use fat also. All three of those systems come on at the same time, but fat is very slow in terms of building up enough energy. So during a very fast event or high output event, it's just not really used that much. But all three are on, and it's just the rates of flow that determine what's used the most. And so that when you go to rest, you're not moving, then your body uses a lot more fat. So trying to appreciate that it's a dynamic system. And then, of course, how can you take advantage of that with clients that's in a practical setting so that eventually their body becomes more metabolically flexible and all those processes become almost much more automated. So if they fast, they just, switched to using body fat. That's pretty easy. It wasn't too bad. Oh, boy, I went to the buffet and, had, a whole bunch of food. Okay, so high insulin. I'm just going to use a lot more carbohydrates and, I'm still okay. So instead of trying to constantly alter their environment the rest of their life and be like uber restrictive and, carry their food around everywhere and being worried about, looking at a donut, in essence, trying to, within reason, allow their body to be more adaptable so that when they're in those situations that it can, adapt to that and become better, which ironically I think is almost what the paleo people are trying to get at, and they're becoming, much more closer, right? If you're survival based, if woolly mammoth comes around, you better be really good at eating woolly mammoth for like 3 to 5 days. No woolly mammoths for a while, well, you better be okay not eating anything for a period of time. I think that's actually more beneficial than trying to say, ooh, only these foods are good, ooh, those are horrible type thing.
Outstanding. Well, Mike, I appreciate you coming on. It was phenomenal.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And I look forward to Kansas City in May.
For sure.
So everyone, if you want to check out Mike's site and his articles, go to miketnelson.com to check out everything there. Once again, Mike, I appreciate it. And everyone, I appreciate you for tuning in to this episode of the Art of Physical Fitness Show. And until next time, I will talk to you later.
Thank you.